Well, now we are live. We are very happy to welcome a very special guest on the DD Geo-Politics podcast, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Dr. Papadopoulos is an expert on Russian history and politics and Eastern Europe more broadly, and we're very pleased to welcome him here. But I think the man himself can give himself a better introduction. So, Dr. Papadopoulos, could you please tell our listeners a bit about yourself?
Certainly. First of all, let me say how delighted I am to have been invited onto your channel, and I'm greatly looking forward to our discussion. As regards myself, yes, I am a doctor of Russian history. I obtained my PhD from Royal Holloway, University of London. For many years now, to be precise, 17 years, I have been writing about and speaking about Russia and the former Soviet Union for 17 years now. And in addition to that, for 17 years as well, I have been talking about the former Yugoslavia, in particular, the reasons as to why the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, more commonly known as Tito's Yugoslavia, which existed from 1943 to 1991, why this country imploded as it did in the 1990s.
Definitely something that we will be touching on. To start with, though, I think we'll be going chronologically because we have a few things to cover. One of which is perceptions of the Russian military, or more laterally, the Soviet military, but since that transitioned into being the Russian military, it is topical, and even more broadly still, Russophobia, especially British Russophobia, and where it comes from, and why certain tropes just simply do not ever seem to end. And I think that you are an excellent person to answer this question, Doctor, because you wrote a book that I've had the privilege of being able to have a look in, but sadly not yet finish it. But Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, British Assessments of the Red Army, 1934 to 1945. And I can say straight away that from the parts that I have been able to get through and read, that I would highly recommend it to anybody. And I was hoping to give you a chance to talk a bit about your book here, because what you reveal in terms of how it was something so important, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s, such as the Red Army was incredibly important for shaping diplomatic perceptions in Britain of the Soviet Union, its utility as an ally, perhaps as a threat, and how this changed over time in the period under consideration. So could you tell our listeners a bit about how it started in the period, about 1934, how the UK government perceived the Red Army, why it perceived it as such, and how close this was to reality?
From the outset, I would like to make a number of very brief observations, because I think it is important to clarify some matters. First of all, Russophobia is racism. Russophobia is fear and dislike, suspicion of Russia and Russians. And historically speaking, in the context of Britain, there is another dimension. And that dimension is a sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority, the view that Anglo-Saxons are superior to Russians because Russians are, predominantly speaking, Slavs, and Slavs by their very nature are inefficient, disorganized, and barbaric. That was the view of many British officials, though by no means all, during the period that my new book covers, from 1934 to 1945. But again, Russophobia is racism. We live in a day and age in the Western world where there are two definitions of racism: the true definition and the fake definition. The true definition of racism is when a member of a tribe, a race, consider their tribe or race to be superior to other tribes and or races. And on top of that, when a member of a tribe or a race consider other tribes and other races to be inferior, that is the true definition of racism. But in the Western world today, we have the fake definition, which is put out by the Western ruling elites, Western governments, globalists, or however you wish to describe the people who rule, not govern, rule the Western world. So the fake definition of racism is as follows. If you oppose immigration, if you oppose multiculturalism, if you believe in the preservation of a people's cultural and spiritual values, you are racist, and that constitutes racism. So as I said, that is the fake definition of racism. But in the periods that my book covers, from 1934 to 1945, I demonstrate through the use of primary source evidence, specifically British government files, such as Foreign Office files, military files, intelligence files, which clearly demonstrates that Russophobia, racism towards Russians, was embedded in Whitehall. And Russophobia didn't emerge in Whitehall in 1934. In the introduction to my book, I take it back briefly to 1553, because it was in 1553 when London and Moscow first established diplomatic relations between themselves. And what we see is that the impressions of English officials, then British officials, visiting Russia were very, very negative. British officials, for example, they referred to the Russian language as revolting. They referred to Russia as a Oriental backward tyranny. They referred to Russians as mere pygmies in comparison to Anglo-Saxons. And that goes from 1553 all the way up until 1870. But in 1870, there is a turning point, because in 1870, the Russian Empire completed its conquest of Central Asia, and that brought the Russian Empire into very close proximity to that of British India. And that fueled Russophobia in Whitehall and in British society as a whole, because the British believed that the Russians were menacing the jewel in the crown, British India. So we see a dramatic increase in evidence of Russophobia. Then, of course, we have World War I, where Britain and Russia, or the British Empire and the Russian Empire, find themselves on the same side. And it is an unnatural alliance. The same would be repeated during the Second World War, when Britain and the Soviet Union found themselves in what was an unnatural alliance. But even though they were allies in World War I and then later on in World War II, British suspicion and dislike of Russia and Russians remained very, very evident. If we now proceed to the period that my book covers, I want to make it very clear that from 1934 to 1945, there were quite a number of British officials, in particular diplomats, who did not share a loathing and a distrust of Russia and Russians. Far from it. Indeed, my book is dedicated to the memory of Sir Laurence Collier. Laurence Collier was the head of the Northern Department from the mid-1930s up until 1941. And the Northern Department was a department within the Foreign Office which was responsible for analysing matters relating to the USSR. And Laurence Collier was very interesting in that he was arguing from as early as 1934 for an alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union to deter Nazi Germany from expansionism. Even though such an alliance didn't come about, the reasons being outlined in my book, nonetheless, it is very important to say that there were a group of very brave British diplomats who did not view Russia, or the Soviet Union to be more precise, with the distrust and dislike that many British officials in Whitehall had towards the Russians. They were very, very brave men. So why were perceptions of the Red Army important to the British government from 1934 to 1945? Well, assessments of Red Army capability provided an important element to British strategic planning. So from 1934 up until August of 1939, the British government listened or were prepared to consider the possibility of an alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union as a way of deterring Hitler from expansionism. And of course, to deter Hitler from expansionism, the British needed to know, are the Germans fearful of Soviet military capability, and in particular, Soviet offensive prowess? So that is why British diplomats, for example, in the Northern Department, such as Laurence Collier, instructed numerous British Army officers to visit Russia, to attend Soviet Army maneuvers from 1934 to 1939, to visit Red Army barracks, institutes, etc., to determine what are the defensive and offensive capabilities of the Soviet military. If it was found that the Soviet military has developed an all-round good ability to prosecute war, then the British government, then that would be fed to the Foreign Secretary, that would be fed to the Defence Secretary, to the Cabinet, to the Prime Minister. Then it would be down to them to decide, should Britain seriously entertain the prospect of an alliance with the Soviet Union? Then, following the pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, more commonly known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a lot of British officials viewed the Soviet Union no longer as a potential ally of Britain against Hitler, but as a potential enemy, because they believed that Hitler and Stalin had joined forces to carve up Europe between themselves. So assessments of the Red Army took on a new dimension. The British government wanted to learn what were the capabilities of the Red Army, because the Red Army is now a potential enemy of Britain. The British Army could end up fighting the Red Army. But still, there were a lot of British diplomats, again in the Northern Department, who did not view Russia as a potential enemy. They argued that Stalin had consented to the pact with Hitler out of necessity. The Winter War, when the Soviet Union fought against Finland, increased the perception of a number of British officials in Whitehall that the Soviet Union was in cahoots with Germany, and they were looking to carve up Europe between themselves, between Germany and the Soviet Union. Then, of course, going into 1941, the British government starts to realize that Nazi Germany is more than likely going to invade the Soviet Union. Therefore, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were never natural allies. They were never friends in the first place, despite the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So then the British government assesses the capabilities of the Red Army to determine if Hitler invades the Soviet Union, what sort of resistance would the Red Army provide against the Germans, and what assistance could Britain offer to the Red Army? And then from June 1941 up until the summer of 1943, so June 1941 is Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. July 1943 is when the Red Army breaks the back of the Wehrmacht during the Battle of Kursk. So from that period, from 41 to 43, the British are assessing the Red Army because it is absolutely imperative for Britain's survival in the war, to learn what are the chances of the Red Army holding out, and what help can Britain and America provide to the Russians to keep the Red Army fighting. From July 1943 all the way to the end of the war in May 1945, the reasons for the British government studying the Red Army change once again. It is clear after Kursk that the Red Army is going to triumph on the Eastern Front, and that the Red Army is going to liberate Soviet lands, is going to enter Eastern Europe, and will enter Germany, the eastern part of Germany. So the British start to become fearful. So they need to know what sort of threat, because Russophobia was embedded in the minds of so many key British officials. The power of the Red Army from 43 to 45 was causing great consternation for these British officials, mainly British military officials and British intelligence officials, not so much British diplomats. British diplomats, again, had a very different stance on Russia. But for the British military establishment and the British intelligence establishments, they wanted to learn what sort of threat would the Red Army pose to Britain after Hitler is defeated. And finally, my book documents that the British diplomats who were in a very bitter feud with their military counterparts in Whitehall proved to be correct. History proved them to be correct, because British diplomats such as Christopher Warner, Gladwin Jebb, and Geoffrey Wilson argued that the British military is already, even though the war with Hitler is going on from 43 to 45, they are already talking about Germany being rebuilt after the war to serve as a counter against perceived Soviet aggression, which means a rearmed Germany. The British military establishment also start talking about the need for there to be a Western military bloc, again, to defend Western Europe, to defend Britain from the perceived clutches of the Red Army. British diplomats argued all of this is in private, of course, they argued that this is undermining the Anglo-Soviet Treaty of May of 1942. This is undermining the Grand Alliance. And because of the views of the British military establishment, there will be no peace after 1945. The Grand Alliance is going to collapse. And British military and British diplomats were saying that more than likely the Soviet government is aware of the opinions of the British military establishment, because one reason is that the British military mission in Moscow, or members of the British military mission in Moscow, were making their views about Russia and Russians very clear in the presence of Soviet officials. They didn't care in the slightest bit. So one British diplomat said, there is every reason to believe that if after Hitler is defeated, a Western military bloc emerges, then the Russians will put together their own military bloc, and Europe will be divided between East and West, between two military blocs. And of course, that is exactly what happened, because after 1945, there's the emergence of NATO, and in response to that, there's the emergence of the Warsaw Pact. So my book brings attention to those British diplomats from 43 to 45 who saw the dangers of Russophobia. They saw the dangers of prejudices towards Russians, and they spoke very openly about it. One British diplomat said that British military officials regard the Russians as a subhuman horde. Another one said that the British army officers are would-be drinkers of Russian blood, and that the views of the British military are going to bring about a confrontation between Britain and the Soviet Union after Hitler is defeated. As I said earlier, British diplomats, largely speaking, were not imbued with Russophobia, but the British military, with the exception of some, such as Lieutenant Colonel Gamble, they were imbued with Russophobia. And no matter how much the British diplomats tried to resist this, tried to avert what they described would be a disaster for the Grand Alliance after Hitler is defeated, they were never able to successfully resist Russophobia. So again, by no means were all British officials hostile towards Russia. It doesn't mean they had any love for the Bolshevik system. They didn't. But they didn't regard Russia as a barbaric country. They didn't regard Russians as subhumans, as barbaric Slavs, as Oriental despots. No, they didn't. And I think that's very important to establish, and for people to know that there are British officials then, and I have no doubt today, who do not regard Russia as this menace to democracy, freedom, and civilization, as is the official stance of the British government, the American government, and other Western governments today.
Well, you've brought up a lot of stereotypes that we keep hearing today. And one thing that I wanted to focus on, in part because it's as far as I got, was your chapter on the Winter War and how during the Winter War and after it, the perceptions of the Red Army changed, and not for the better. Can you tell us more about where the British military was getting its information from in terms of Red Army performance in that war, why it was believed, and why, despite the opening of the Soviet archives, has it been a case that things such as well, the Finns said it, is more or less taken on faith, and
Yes.
there hasn't been any critical re-examination of this. Or in other words, why do these sorts of tropes, despite the fact that there's the possibility to revisit them, or even that they've been debunked, just keep shambling along like a zombie that hasn't been touched?
Well, first of all, overall, the Red Army's performance against Finland was woeful. That is irrefutable. Though towards the end of the war, the Red Army did start to perform far better than how it had previously. The Soviet Army and the Soviet Air Force started to show real initiative in its planning for ground attacks and air attacks. But again, overall, the performance was woeful, and the Soviet High Command were very aware of that. And following the end of the Winter War in March of 1940, reforms were drastically implemented in the Red Army to try and remedy the problems which had been experienced from the Russians from November of 1939 to March of 1940. As regards to how did the British, or how was the British assessment formed on the Red Army's performance? Well, of course, for example, through British intelligence. That's one way they established it. Secondly, through the British Embassy in Helsinki, they were able to speak with Finnish diplomats, speak with Finnish military officials to discuss how is the Red Army performing? How is the Red Air Force performing? Why are the Russians not making any progress, even though they outnumber the Finnish army by a very great amount in terms of manpower and in terms of equipment? Also, the British were able to gather assessments on the Red Army's performance by talking to their German, or not talking to their German counterparts, but by British intelligence, which was still operating in Germany and, of course, in parts of Europe. So that was very, very important for the British. But what is clear is that whilst the Winter War demonstrated that a number of British assessments prior to the Winter War had been vindicated, the British government, after the Winter War ended, hastily concluded that the Red Army, in simple English, is finished. Even in defensive warfare, there are now doubts about its ability, but certainly offensively, whatever progress the Russians had made from 1934 to 1939 had been decimated. So, with benefit of hindsight, it is clear that the British hastily drew that conclusion. But as I said, assessments of the Red Army prior to the Winter War were vindicated by the British. And it wasn't just the British. Indeed, my book does refer very briefly, but refers to American assessments of the Red Army from 34 to 39 and French assessments, and they are very similar. But what you don't have in American assessments and French assessments is the racial dimension that you have in the British assessments. Namely, because the Russians are naturally disorganized, inefficient, stupid, lazy, uncouth, they will never be able to master the art of offensive warfare, though the British said prior to the Winter War, 34 to 39, that in defense, the Red Army would be formidable, but not in offensive warfare. So that is the difference between, on the one hand, British assessments, and on the other hand, American and French assessments.
The last question that will be led for me has to do with your 2022 book, Arise Russia, and the return of Russia to some more of the world stage. I was hoping that you could expound on what, as you saw it, the impact was of Putin's speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference.
First of all, Arise Russia was published in January of 2021. Yes, the Putin speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 was a turning point in international relations, in particular, relations between the West and the Russian Federation. And it also signified a break from how Russian foreign policy had been towards the West prior to 2007. Because in 2007, in Putin's speech in Munich, he identified America, in so many words, as the main threat to international law and the main threat to Russian national security. And within a very short period after Putin's speech, Russia's national security doctrine identified NATO and NATO expansionism as the principal threat to the security of the Russian Federation. Prior to 2007, the Russian national security doctrine identified terrorism, international terrorism, as the principal threat to the Russian Federation. But after Putin's speech, all of that changed. And it is no coincidence that, for example, in the summer of 2007, Russian nuclear bombers began to reappear in the close to the American airspace, close to American airspace adjacent to Alaska, which hadn't been seen since the Cold War. So the Kremlin's decision to send Russian nuclear bombers close to Alaska symbolized that Russia now regarded America, NATO, let's be clear, NATO is America, America is NATO, identified America, NATO, as the principal threat to Russia.
One other thing before I turn it over to Stefan. In the beginning of that book, you talk about how important it is for us to, as in generally for anybody considering this question, to understand the impact of the 1990s. And that one of the things that you identify is an empathy deficit, particularly among much of elite Western analysis of the impact of the 1990s and what it signifies for Russia and for ordinary Russians, not just elite Russians, but ordinary Russians. Why do you think that empathy deficit persists, and why the 1990s are still spoken about in the West as being a good time, when actually, if you look at things such as simply GDP growth statistics, it self-evidently was a horrible time?
It was far worse than horrible. It was absolutely catastrophic. It was one of the greatest catastrophes to strike Russia and the Russian people in Russian history. Well, let your audience know this, that the Russian people, the Soviet people as a whole, never consented to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I say dissolution, not collapse. The Soviet Union never collapsed. It was dissolved. In March of 1991, the useless Mikhail Gorbachev did something correct for once. He held a national referendum in the Soviet Union in which the Soviet people were asked, do you wish to preserve the Soviet Union? 76% of the Soviet people voted to preserve the Soviet Union, which utterly refutes the lie, the myth, which has long been put out by the West, that the Soviet Union was a prison of peoples. The reality is that there were only two parts of the Soviet Union that never wished to be a part of the Union. Firstly, the Baltic states. Secondly, the westernmost part of Ukraine, by which I mean Lvov, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, Rivne, and Volyn. Those oblasts, regions of Ukraine, which are on the border, or some of them very close to the Polish border, the reason why they never wanted to be a part of the Soviet Union, the reason why that is the only part of Ukraine where you will find pure, unadulterated hatred towards Russia and Russians, is because those regions were for centuries occupied by the Poles, the Lithuanians, then the Austrians, and then the Poles again. But going back to what I said, the Soviet people never consented to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Why was it dissolved? Ultimately, because of Yeltsin. He had a personal vendetta against the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He had a personal vendetta against Gorbachev, and he had a personal vendetta against the Soviet Union as a whole. And he, along with Kravchuk in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and Shushkevich in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, came together in December of 1991 to sign an accord between themselves to dissolve the Soviet Union. Three men, three politicians dissolved an entire country against the will of the people. And at that time, the population of the Soviet Union was approximately 300 million. It's quite remarkable what those three men did. But it happened. So going into the 1990s, yes, Russia experienced what I would argue to be an unprecedented political, economic, military, and societal meltdown. Everything that the Russian people had previously enjoyed in the Soviet Union, security from birth to grave, from cradle to grave, a job for life, a home for life, free healthcare, magnificent transport, no homelessness, very, very little crime, etc., was a thing of the past. The economic and the economic cancer which took hold of Russia and spread throughout the whole of Russia like a wildfire absolutely decimated the fabric of Russian society. Why does the West, or the Western ruling elites, to be more precise, view the 1990s as a good period for Russia? Well, firstly, because Russia was on its hands and knees. Russia wasn't on its knees, it was on its hands and knees, and could not stand up to NATO expansionism. They could not stand up to the role of the West in dismembering the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And secondly, Russia was ruled by a pro-Western president by the name of Boris Yeltsin, whom I previously mentioned. So that is why for the West it was a golden period for them. And I suppose if I was in their shoes, I would regard it as a golden period. because it meant that America was the sole superpower in the world. Without challenges, they could do as they please. Russia could be ignored. The Russians didn't even have enough fuel for their tanks to parade on Red Square. So they're hardly in a position to challenge NATO expansion into Eastern Europe and American involvement in the war in Croatia, and the American involvement in the war in Bosnia, and the American involvement in the war in Kosovo and Metohija. But for Russia and for the Russian people, that was one of the worst periods in their history, one of the most painful, one of the most cataclysmic, one of the most humiliating. When a Russian thinks of the 1990s, they think of anarchy and abject pain and suffering for their motherland and for their people. So your audience must understand that the reason why the West, even today, talks about the 1990s as having been the period when the Russians were, in the Western lexicon, progressing. Well, the Russians weren't progressing, they were regressing, but they were, for the West, they were progressing in that they were on the verge of becoming a spent force, never to rise again.
Well, you brought up the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and Stefan, I know you had some questions about that and that which followed.
I do. Just a bit of, I guess, fast forward to the modern day. I'm sure recently, Marcus, you've heard about the Council of Europe putting forward the recommendation that Kosovo be formally invited to become a member of the COE. So I guess my question is, so do you believe that, much like its unilateral and illegal declaration of so-called independence in 2008, that this move by the COE on behalf of Kosovo will open up yet another geopolitical Pandora's box and start permitting other disputed non-state territories to join the COE and other organizations in the future as well?
Like the United Nations, the Council of Europe many years ago lost all credibility. The concept of the Council of Europe, like the concept of the United Nations, is an admirable one. It is an honorable one. However, and regrettably, like the United Nations, the Council of Europe has been penetrated by the Western elites, has been subverted by the Western elites, has been politicized by the Western elites, and has been weaponized by the Western elites, all in support of Western foreign policy, in support of the strategic objectives of the Western ruling elites, or globalists, however you wish to describe the people who rule, not govern, rule the Western world. So that the Council of Europe have invited the so-called Republic of Kosovo to join, and that Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe in 2022, demonstrates its political nature. Because if the Council of Europe was truly independent, then okay, if it's going to expel Russia because of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, then why didn't it expel Britain and France and other European members for their illegal, criminal, murderous, and barbaric bombing crusade against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999. I would have no problem with Russia being expelled by the Council of Europe if Britain and France and Germany and Italy and others were also expelled from the Council of Europe, but that didn't happen. That is why I say the Council of Europe has no credibility today. Like the United Nations, it has no credibility. The Republic, or the so-called Republic of Kosovo, in reality, is a NATO protectorate. It is there as a way of enhancing Western supremacy in the Western Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia. It is there to contribute to preventing Russian influence and power from re-emerging in the Western Balkans. What is the so-called Republic of Kosovo? It is an illegal entity. It has no legal standing under international law. And it was brought into being by the Americans and others through the use of a terrorist organization, and a terrorist organization which was also an organized crime syndicate. And I am referring to the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army. So that is how the so-called Republic of Kosovo came into being. It is legally, it is an integral part of Serbia. It has no legal standing to be referred to as an independent country. It was torn away from Serbia through the use of force, the NATO bombing crusade in 1999. And then the so-called Republic of Kosovo, or the so-called Parliament of the so-called Republic of Kosovo, in February of 2008, declared unilateral independence. And by the way, that vote was masterminded by the Americans and the British and the European Union. And immediately, the West recognized what was an illegal vote. And yet, when the people of the Crimea in 2014 came together to hold a referendum as to whether the Crimea should reunify with Russia, and they voted to reunify with Russia, the West didn't accept that. The hypocrisy there is extraordinarily blatant. Again, if the West didn't, theoretically speaking, didn't recognize the unilateral declaration by the so-called Republic of Kosovo, and didn't recognize the referendum result in the Crimea in 2014, then fine, there is consistency. But we all know that is not what happens.
Speaking on the subject of Western hypocrisy when it comes to territorial disputes and non-state actors, and sticking to the theme of the Balkans, it is quite curious when you see the West have no issue whatsoever with violating the UN Resolution 1244, which guarantees the territorial integrity of Serbia with Kosovo as an autonomous province. However, the West seems to have different ideas, the complete opposite ideas, when it comes to, say, Republika Srpska in Bosnia. Mm-hmm. So why does the West feel that they can make an exception to violate Serbia's integrity with regards to Kosovo, but when it comes to Republika Srpska potentially breaking away in the future and potentially violating the Dayton agreements and accords, why does the West suddenly desire to adhere to international law?
Because despite the facade that the Western ruling elites have created about themselves, and which they put out to the rest of the world, namely that they are the guardians of international law, in reality, they are the main violators of international law, of the United Nations Charter and the United Nations mechanisms in general. They will violate international law whenever it suits their geostrategic objectives. And no matter how many times they have violated international law, be it the illegal bombing of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999, or the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, their mindset is might is right. We don't care what we do because of our immense political, economic, and military power. So as long as the West has that immense global might, they will keep on violating international law whenever it suits them. You referred to Republika Srpska in Bosnia. Well, again, if the West was genuinely impartial and genuinely committed to international law, then it would apply the principle of self-determination to the Serbs of Bosnia, as they did to the Muslims of Bosnia in 1992. So if the West argued in 1992 that the Muslims of Bosnia do not wish to be a part of Yugoslavia, they wish to be independent, and they cited the principle of self-determination, fine. But they did not apply that right in 1992 to the Serbs of Bosnia. Why? Because the Muslims were their allies. The Serbs were not their allies. The Serbs wanted to keep the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia together. The West did not want that for a number of reasons. And if we fast forward to the present day, 2024, if the West was genuinely committed to the principle of self-determination, it would say to the Serbs of Bosnia, Republika Srpska, if you don't want to be a part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, if you hold a referendum, providing it's free and fair, and if you vote to leave for Republika Srpska to become an independent country, independent sovereign country, then we will recognize that. But they won't. They won't do that. Because the Serbian people, not the politicians in Belgrade, for example, the Serbian people are the adversaries of the West. The West knows that throughout their history, the Serbian people have always resisted foreign aggression. They've always resisted foreign occupation. And in the case of Serbia, ever since the 5th of October of the year 2000, Serbia has been a Western colony. The West engineered the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic through Otpor. It therefore follows every single president and prime minister of Serbia since then has been selected by the Americans, the British, and the European Union to run Serbia how they want it to be run. And if you have a look, since October of 2000, Serbia has overall become a non-entity. Economically, it has been all but destroyed by the puppet government in Belgrade. Culturally, the puppet government in Belgrade has permitted influx of Western liberal values into the country. And I use the word values in a very, very loose way. The puppet government in Belgrade has all but decimated the once powerful Serbian military on the orders of NATO in particular. In every Serbian state institution, NATO has a supervisory office, not an advisory office, a supervisory office, including in the presidential office. So that on its own demonstrates how Serbia is nothing more than a Western colony, regardless of what the likes of Vučić say in public. For example, we will not join the economic crusade against Russia, etc., etc. Well, he would say that in public because he won't say anything else, because he knows that the vast majority of Serbs are sympathetic to the Russians for cultural and spiritual reasons. So it would not be in the interests of Vučić and his masters in Washington, London, and Brussels for him to say otherwise, because that could instigate a popular uprising. But if Vučić is, as he purports to be, an independent, patriotic leader, well, he would withdraw Serbia from the Serbia-NATO Council. He would expel all NATO officials from Serbia, and he would take other various measures to rebuild the Serbian military pride. At present, the Serbian army is comprised of about 4,000 soldiers. Officially, it's something like 16 to 20,000, but in reality, it's 4,000, though there are many, many more police officers in Serbia. And the reason for that is simple, because those police officers play a major role in keeping Vučić in power. It doesn't matter who's the president of Serbia. He or she is merely a puppet. The puppet masters are in the West. And that's the tragic story, tragic story of Serbia. But I have no doubt that the Serbian people will, in due course, rise up, will throw off their shackles, Western shackles, will liberate themselves, and will restore honor to Serbia, and will restore the cultural and spiritual values to Serbia. I have no doubt about that, but it's going to be a long and arduous task, because Serbia has been a Western colony coming up to 24 years, and much, much has happened politically, economically, and culturally. The West has penetrated every aspect of Serbian society. They haven't broken the Serbian people, but the cancer is an extremely aggressive one in Serbia, and the Serbian people will have to gather. They will have to rally to defend themselves, because for the West, the best way to kill a nation is through insidious means, is through killing a nation from within. They don't have to send an army to Serbia to destroy the Serbian people. The best way of killing a nation is to destroy its national identity, to destroy its cultural and spiritual values. And in that, the West has been quite successful in Serbia in the last 24 years.
It's very interesting, actually, when you mention when you bring up the very relevant subject of the easiest way to kill a nation is to kill it spiritually, culturally, socially, what have you. It's also quite ironic and, once again, hypocritical of the West, especially the liberal West. They have this one of their favorite weapons, of course, is to cause social and cultural decay in the country. However, in the case of Ukraine, for example, the same governments and states that would often criticize countries such as Hungary or Poland or Serbia for being very culturally proud and societally strong, all of a sudden are very heavily supporting and promoting hardline Ukrainian nationalism to the point where they are openly supporting neo-Nazi units and organizations such as Right Sector in Ukraine, or even the Russian rebels, the Legion, for example, who have known neo-Nazi sympathies as well. So why is it, in your opinion, does the West feel that social and cultural norms that they would consider nationalistic is suddenly acceptable when Ukraine seemed to have this newfound admiration, as it were, for borderline neo-Nazi ideology, when in the West that would be liable for prosecution, as it were?
Well, let me answer that question by returning to my new book, Whitehall in Stalin's Russia. I document through primary source evidence that in 1944, British Foreign Intelligence, Secret Intelligence Service, more commonly known as MI6, began assisting Ukrainian nationalist fighters in the westernmost part of Ukraine, such as Lvov and Volyn, to fight against the oncoming Red Army. And the reason they did that is because by 1944, the British government understood that the Red Army was winning the contest on the Eastern Front, would win the contest on the Eastern Front, and would be the most powerful landmass from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. So British foreign intelligence began assisting Ukrainian nationalists in the hope of causing internal chaos in that part of the Soviet Union, which would then lead to internal weaknesses, which then could lead to a fracturing of the Soviet Union. They also were supporting nationalist fighters in the Baltic states. This was when the fight against Hitler was ongoing. This was in spite of the Anglo-Soviet Treaty of May of 1942. They're officially allies, and yet the British military establishment, British intelligence, are seeking and are actively looking to undermine their Soviet ally. Fast forward to the present, well, the West will get into bed, so to speak, with anyone, providing that person serves the geostrategic objectives of the West. That person could be a neo-Nazi, that person could be an Islamist, but providing they are serving the interests of Western global hegemony, Western global supremacy, then the West will work with them. The West will fund them. The West will train them. The West will finance them. The West will arm them. They did so in Bosnia during the Bosnian Civil War. The Americans facilitated the arrival of Mujahideen fighters from Afghanistan to Bosnia during the Bosnian Civil War, including a one Osama bin Laden, who was then granted a Bosnian passport by the Bosnian Muslim authorities, led by Alija Izetbegović. So for the West, all that matters is that an organization, a movement, or individuals are willing to serve the interests of Western foreign policy. And if they're willing to serve the interests of Western foreign policy, then the West will work with them, irrespective of what their nature is.
In the case of when we were speaking about puppet states and puppet regimes, as it were, one particular region that seems to have completely gotten lost in the whole maelstrom, as it were, of modern geopolitics. Of course, we're seeing things in Armenia and Azerbaijan starting to kick up a bit more, but we still don't hear enough about Cyprus, for example, and the so-called Northern Cyprus issue. When everything else is going on globally, we're still, a lot of the people in the West, a lot of governments in the West seem to be forgetting that there is still an ongoing occupation of a sovereign state involving two NATO member states. So what is NATO's hold up in addressing this particular issue in the Mediterranean, especially one geographically close to the Middle East, specifically the Levant region with Israel and Palestine and whatnot?
Well, the situation in Cyprus is a lengthy subject matter to discuss. But in essence, Cyprus is unofficially a NATO island because in the south, you have British military bases, which actually form part of British overseas territories. You have a French military presence as well. whereas in the illegally occupied north, the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, you have the Turkish army, which of course is a member of NATO. So for NATO, the situation, the political divide in Cyprus, works perfectly for its interests, for its aspirations, because for all intents and purposes, Cyprus is a NATO island. And because of its geostrategic importance being in the Eastern Mediterranean, NATO, excuse me, can use the British listening radars in Cyprus to eavesdrop on a very, very large area. So the British listening installations in Cyprus cover much of the Middle East and cover a considerable part of North Africa. So for NATO, having the Turks in the north and the British and the French in the south is a win-win. It should also be said that the Israelis have an unofficial military presence in the south as well. All of this has been allowed in by the Cypriot government. The Cypriot government is not a patriotic government. It's a puppet government. It serves the interests of the West. And the puppet government in Nicosia, despite its public pronouncements about the Turks, is doing everything that its masters tell them to do to ensure that Cyprus remains divided. But it is interesting when the British government, for example, says that they will never recognize the independence of Abkhazia or South Ossetia, two regions which broke away from Georgia. Fine, they don't recognize that. Okay. But when it comes to the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, there's a very interesting dimension. Officially, Britain doesn't recognize the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Why? Because there's no legal basis for it. However, in London, the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus has an unofficial embassy. That tells you much about the duplicity of British foreign policy vis-a-vis Cyprus. Because why is it that the British government does not allow South Ossetia and Abkhazia to have an unofficial embassy in London? Well, the reason being is that Britain and Turkey are historically strategic partners. They are strategic friends and allies. Britain, to this day, is a guarantor, supposed to be a guarantor of the territorial integrity of the Republic of Cyprus. The Republic of Cyprus covers the entire island. Yet, in July of 1974, after the Turkish military invaded, Britain did not carry out its guarantor obligation to protect the territorial integrity of the Republic of Cyprus, by which I mean that Britain was obliged to have used military force against the Turks to prevent the Turks from capturing a part of the Republic of Cyprus. That's what Britain's responsibility is, as being one of Cyprus's guarantors, but they never did that. You have to ask yourself why that is. Maybe for another day we can have that discussion. It's a lengthy matter. It's a complicated matter. But if you put that to a British government official, why did Britain not respond to Turkish military aggression by employing the British military? There's British military bases there. Why didn't they fulfill their responsibility as a guarantor of the Republic of Cyprus? Well, I can assure you from now they will choose not to comment on that. So NATO, Cyprus is today an unofficial NATO island. There will be no reunification of Cyprus. It's very sad, but that is the reality regarding that country. It is controlled by the West. It is controlled by NATO, and it serves the interests of the West and Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean, in North Africa, and West Asia as a whole.
Well, we do have one final question for you, Dr. Papadopoulos, which is that clearly the world is changing and changing quite. I'm sorry, I've just been told by my co-host that I went silent. Did you get my question, Doctor?
Unfortunately, I didn't hear a word of your question. I'm sorry about that. It went silent.
No, that's entirely my fault. Which is, my question was on how you see the, more broadly speaking, so leaving to one side the conflict in Ukraine and all of that, because that's its own whole separate can of worms. How do you broadly see the global balance of power developing within the next 5 to 10 years, absent a major war?
I believe that as we speak now, the Western global order, which has been in existence since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is now falling apart. That doesn't mean that American power will collapse. It doesn't mean that American influence in all four corners of the world will collapse. American power will remain formidable, though, of course, there are some very, very serious divisions at home in America, which could lead to secession or could lead to civil war. But I believe that the golden period for the West has come to an end. For some 30 years, they were the masters of the world because there was no rival superpower. That, of course, has now changed. So I do believe we are going from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. But let me qualify that. Russia is a military and nuclear superpower. So therein lies the ultimate challenge to America in the world. China, in my opinion, constitutes the economic challenge to America in the world. There's no doubt about it that the Chinese military have taken great steps forward in modernizing themselves. But two things. Firstly, in many ways, the People's Liberation Army is the largest armed forces museum in the world. Much of the Chinese military equipment is obsolete. Secondly, the Chinese military is an unknown quantity. On paper, it is extremely powerful, but in practice, how powerful is it? What is its offensive capabilities? What are its defensive capabilities? No doubt, like the British did in the period my new book covers, at present, the British and the Americans are trying to assess what is the offensive prowess of the Chinese military. Would they be able to capture Taiwan? How do they compare? How do their land forces compare with the American land forces? So, yes, we are entering a multipolar world, but we should not think that India, for example, or Brazil or South Africa are going to be major global players. They won't. They will have an important role to play. But as I said, in military terms and in nuclear terms, the ultimate challenge to America is, of course, Russia. The ultimate counterbalance to America is Russia. And economically, the Chinese are the ultimate counterbalance to the Americans in economic terms. Should the Chinese launch an offensive to take back Taiwan, which is politically, legally, and culturally an integral part of China, then we will see just how capable the Chinese Navy is, the Chinese Air Forces, and the Chinese Army is. The last major encounter that the Chinese military had was in the late 1970s, when they fought against the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese inflicted grievous losses. Thousands upon thousands of Chinese soldiers were killed. Now, I know that is over 40 years ago, but my point is this. Yes, the Chinese have progressed extensively in developing an armed forces, but just how capable is it in practice? We don't know. It's an unknown quantity, as I say, and perhaps the day is coming, and coming quite soon, that we will see just how competent the People's Liberation Army is vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Dr. Papadopoulos, thank you very, very much for your time and for your insights. And for our listeners, once again, I would very warmly recommend his 2021 book, Arise, Russia, and his 2023 book, Whitehall in Stalin's Russia. Once again, thank you very much, and thank you to my co-host, Stefan.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.